Call to order, Prescott Valley Town Work Study Meeting, November 3rd. Clerk, please call the roll.
Councilmember Kinzinger.
Present.
Councilmember Dickinson.
Here.
Councilmember Hepperly is not here today. Councilmember Schumacher.
Present.
Councilmember Packard.
Present.
Vice Mayor Hunt.
Here.
Mayor Palguda.
Present.
We have a quorum.
Thank you, ma'am. Sir, you are the only show. You're the one-man show today. Item 2 is Land Use Development Code Amendment. Mr. Frank Cassidy.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor, members of the council. Thank you for having us back. We've, as you can see, since the end of August, when we had our previous meeting, we've been in the grind of the meat grinder a little bit in terms of getting into the code and cranking out some things. So I wanted to give you sort of an overview of where we're at and get some feedback. It's a good time for getting feedback because really the next step is to create the table that I think you ought to go to. And in going to that table, it's good to get your feedback on things, on land uses that you're sensitive about. And we can talk about some of the land uses that appear to be treated sensitively in the code that, in my view, as an outsider, I don't really get why they would be treated sensitively, but maybe, you know, that's why we have these conversations. But so the first thing that I had covered, I believe, in the previous discussion was trying to simplify the really the different districts. You've got zoning districts and you've got density districts. You got 16 zoning districts, 14 density districts. I mean, theoretically, that's a lot of potential combinations. Of course, then the code then says you don't actually apply the density districts to agricultural, so that takes out some possible combinations. You don't really apply them to PAD. PAD is kind of a special thing, so you don't apply it to that. But even with what's left, you got about 196 possible combinations. Then you look at the different commercial zoning ordinances. The commercial districts have their own density regulations. I mean, right up front in the density chapter, it says the yard requirements don't apply to any of the commercial. But I think when you look at the individual commercial zones, they appear to overrule the general density rules. So I think at the end of the day, what you're really looking at are the density districts for the zones that I have in front of you on this first chart here. And so what I did is I asked staff, Ernest went out and worked with your GIS folks to let me know, well, how prevalent are these districts then in the town? That's where we got this chart that's in front of you now. And as you can see, most of the combinations, of the possible combinations, are not being used. I mean, you can theoretically use them, but you can see you've got 0 acreage on many of these possible combinations. And on a couple of them, you've got very little acreage, 3 acres of R210. You got 0.84 acres of RS70. So, I mean, really very little utilization. I think it's pretty clear from this that it would be possible to reduce the number of combinations in your code and go to more of a straight zoning where even though you would have a density element to it, it would be treated as a single district. So you might have R1L 10, R1L 18, R1L 70. Obviously, you don't have any R1L 175, so that would disappear. So that right away would simplify things, in my opinion. So that would be my direction, pending feedback from you on that. And even with this, there are some other things that in looking at the actual regulations caused me to believe that you could even simplify it a little further. So for example, your RCU zone, if you look at your regulations for your RCU zone, they're really identical to the R1L. I'm not sure what the history is. I did talk a little bit to Fernando about it, and the comment was, well, the RCU was created to attempt to assist the council when you're annexing property from the county. But in my view, because you have the density district flexibility already, I'm not sure you really even needed the RCU. So I would be sort of inclined to try to eliminate that. The trouble with eliminating a zone, though, is that means you're in a rezoning situation. That means people who currently have RCU, you're going to have to rezone. That's going to require a different kind of notice and things like that. And we can get to that level of detail when we're down the road. But nevertheless, I think in terms of simplification, it doesn't add anything to have the RCU, in my view, unless maybe one of you or staff will know some element of history that I'm perhaps missing. So that's in a nutshell what we're looking at in terms of the density districts discussion, and that sort of covers the first part of my outline. And I'd be happy to answer any of that, any questions you might have arising out of this first section here. And short of that, I'll just pursue that district simplification consolidation process. So the second and probably the more complicated thing was to actually look at the land uses as they're found in your code and figure out whether they're consistent through the code, whether they make sense. And so most of the discussion today, I'm going to want to spend on that process. Because as I mentioned when we first met, one of my big goals is to try to simplify those land uses. Right now, you've got lots of pages of code that, in my opinion, can probably be reduced down to a couple of pages of tables. And so the process of doing that simplification is going to require us to come to some agreement and understanding about what uses belong where. And to get there, you kind of have to know, well, what uses do we have and where are they right now? So to that end, I think, first of all, the residential land uses, which are sort of on the second attachment, which, it is several pages, but that's actually ends up being kind of a simple, relatively straightforward table compared to the one that analyzes the land uses in the non-residential zones. So on this one, I don't think there's that much complication. Working with staff, I think we can nail down the uses on the residential side a little bit. What I think we'd like the most feedback on, or at least I would like the most feedback on for today, is all of these land uses in the non-residential zoning districts. So I gave you this pretty detailed table here. You might wonder, in the left-hand column, I've got these uses that are listed here. Those uses are taken directly from your code. In other words, that's exactly the way the uses are listed. So if you say, well, what do bakeries, bookstores, stationery, and gift shops have in common? Well, I'm not sure, but they're listed together in your code. So if you look in chapter 13, let's see, I think it's about right in this vicinity here. So in the C1, so for example, you'll see bakeries, book, stationery, or gift shops, and that's exactly how I have those uses listed, bakeries, book, stationery, gift shop. The only thing I've done for purposes of this table is I've just stuck them all together in a long list and then put the district designations right here, as you can see. And then I've colored areas that I think are like, well, I'm not sure I understand why this is, or I've colored the orange ones to say we should discuss these. And I've colored the red ones to say, I think this is missing. I think you're missing information here. So the missing ones typically come from a situation where there's a conditional use that's allowed in the C3, or a use that's allowed as with a conditional, on a conditional basis with a use permit in the C3. And then you go to PM and it says you're allowed to have any use that's permitted in the C3. In other words, if it's on the permitted list, then it automatically carries forward, but it doesn't say what it does with the conditional uses. And so the first time you see, for example, amusement parks again is as a conditional use in the M1, so you don't know in the performance manufacturing zone whether it's allowed or not. It's just a question mark, so we've been trying to work through some of those. And then this goldenrod color are things where I'm basically looking at them and saying, well, okay, antique stores, that's one of those things where I'm thinking toy store, antique store, it's widgets, one kind of widget or another kind of widget, but for whatever reason, under your code, you cannot have an antique store in the C1. You could have a toy store, you can have other things in the C1. You can have various kinds of service, simple service in the C1, but you can't have appliance repair shops in the C1. I mean, you can have other simple service things. So that's basically what this table did, was to look at all of these similar uses, and some of which, by putting them in alphabetical order, you could see that, oh, we've kind of changed the terminology a little bit. Like in one place, it'll say upholstery is listed as like something you can sell in an auto parts store in C2, but you can't have an upholstery shop until C3. Which, okay, as long as you're thinking of it as the widget, the sale of the material, but in the list of uses, it just says upholstery. So somebody might argue with you, well, it says upholstery, and I want to do reupholstery. Well, actually, the way it's interpreted in the town, by town staff, upholstery as, if you want to be an auto upholsterer, you got to have C3. But in any event, so by having them listed this way, it allowed us to sort of take a look at some of the inconsistencies through the uses. But I'm not going to, I provided that for you with all the footnotes and everything. And by the way, if you look at this on your computer, these are hyperlinked. So thankfully, you'll say, maybe. But so when you touch the footnotes, it'll either take you to the first time the footnote appears, or it'll actually take you to the footnote. So, you know, it does allow you to jump around sort of automatically when you have time to mess with this on your own. But kind of what I wanted to talk a little bit about was that as we move forward, I think one of the elements of simplification is taking some of these uses that are listed in this sort of, in my view, sort of haphazard way in your current code, and just sticking them into land use groups. And really, right now, as as you can see from your code, it does sort of follow this, like it'll say business or professional, and then it'll put uses that kind of are like business or professional in that. So it might have been simpler to have called the use category just business or professional, and then have a definition someplace that that combined all of those together. And that's sort of what I'm going for in my simplification. So on this outline, I've sort of put some of these together. So in my view, it makes some sense for you to consider having a more generic retail group, where you just put all of the retail group things that have similar land use impacts, and you just sort of stick them together. So I've put them under the outline here, but I've italicized ones that you probably want to talk about. For example, ones that aren't currently allowed in the C1. So for example, I'm thinking that the retail group is all of the low-impact retail uses. Right now, as I said before, antique stores are not in that group. You can't have those until C2. But in my view, I thought, well, obviously it would be giving people more rights, which under the Prop 207 situation, as long as you're giving them more rights, you're probably okay. I mean, you are okay, not probably okay. You are okay if you give them more rights. You're not going to get a 207 claim by giving somebody more uses in their zone. Their next door neighbor might complain about it, but their next door neighbor can't have a 207 claim for that either. But in any event, so here are some of the things that, in my view, might work together, but this is a good time to get your feedback on it so that if you have concerns about some of these, and some of them are pretty straightforward, camera stores, flower shops, those are all things that are already allowed in the C1. And remember that in the C1 district, this is a district that is sort of a transition from the residential zone. So even with the C1 district, it's not like you're going to get big box retail. You have a size limitation on these retail uses just as a result of the C1, standard C1 regulations, which is basically 2,000 square feet. You're talking about pretty small retail. So in these, right now, antique stores are not allowed in C1. Furniture stores are not allowed in C1. Gun shops, which could be considered a locally undesirable land use, Lulu, or maybe not, depending on how you're thinking about a gun shop. If you think of it as just more widgets, but it happens to be guns, then it fits. If you think of it as, oh my goodness, that's sort of a Lulu, let's keep it separate.
Mr. Cassidy, can I
yes,
just
sir.
interrupt you for one moment?
Yes.
And Mr. Gonzalez, maybe you can help out with this. Can you share with the council where exactly, where would C1 areas be in the town of Prescott Valley, just so people have an understanding of where that portion of zoning is around town?
Typically, Mayor, Vice Mayor, Council, typically it's around residential areas, let's say Robert Road and Spouse, where you have a majority of residential uses. You have some neighborhood commercial uses, outlying areas on Florentine or behind Florentine.
Okay.
So it's closer to the residential component. As you start separating away, you'll see the C2 along Spouse, and between Robert and Ranger, there's a couple of commercial buildings in there that are just on Spouse, and their backyard is residential. So anywhere in the town, and mostly those are the C2 areas, not more out into 69 or Florentine or Valley.
Mr. Mayor, Fernando, so along Glassford Hill, Fry's, all that is C2?
That is correct,
Okay.
Vice Mayor. It's C2 along.
And all along 69 is C2?
Along 69 is C2 and C3.
Thank you, sir.
You're welcome.
So I have a question.
Vice Mayor has a question.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Mr. Cassidy, so going back to your letter here, under number 2A21, where you said, let's take the U designation out. Am I reading that right? On the table, you said, further simplify use tables by changing all U designations to Ps.
Yes, I'm sorry, Councilmember Hunt, or Vice Mayor Hunt. If you'll notice, I provided the two use tables, one for residential, which has actually 5 designations on the list, and then in the commercial, to simplify it, I only used 4. So in the commercial table, I used a P to say it's permitted outright or permitted with conditions, with standard conditions, whereas in the residential table, I separated those out. If it was outright permitted, I put a P, and in the residential table, I put a U if it had use conditions. And then I have a separate table in the residential for those use conditions. But I think probably what we can do, as I said in the outline here, is change the use to Ps with, sort of as I did in the other table, with a footnote saying, well, yeah, it's permitted, but you have to follow these requirements. It's just one more way to eliminate another letter designation is all.
So in the residential table where you have 5 of them, the P, of course, is permitted use. No, I mean, just permitted use, no conditions.
Correct.
And that's an easy thing, like an existing building with hooked up to utilities and a C1 use, or a use can go in, totally compatible, no conditions. So the A means accessory use located on the same lot. So that's
Correct.
like some
Correct.
sort of.
So there has to be a primary use already there, and then you want, say, a garage to be built on a
Workshop,
residential or a
second
shop,
unit.
something like that, yes.
Yeah. Does that include second units?
No, right now it does not.
Okay.
That would be another discussion we would need to have. And as you know from being at the housing meeting, one of the things the Housing Committee of the state legislature is talking about is maybe forcing all local governments to allow second or even maybe third units on individual single-family residences. So, I mean, that's possibly out there as a condition. Right now, this simply reflects, this table reflects what your current code says.
So then the C also means issuance of a use permit, and the U means conditions described. And you're recommending doing away with the U?
Simply, yes, Vice Mayor, as a practical matter, it would be the same thing, but on the table, yes, it would now be a P with a footnote to say, okay, yes, it's permitted, but you have to jump through these hoops to get it.
And will that refer you to a different section in the code that tells you what the hoops are?
Yes.
Okay.
And the idea here being, if you look at your current code, for example, you will repeat in each of the zoning districts, you repeat a lot of the same conditions for the same uses. This would allow you to centralize that cross-reference into one general category that says, all right, for this use, no matter where it is in town, you've always got to do these things with it. So yes, it becomes a P with a footnote. And the reason I think it would be helpful that way is because if you put a U next to it, somebody's going to think that means you need a conditional use permit or a use permit, and as it's called in your code. A use permit is, that is something that a person has to ask for, and you have the discretion to deny. Right. So the things on this list that have a C are actually the use permit,
Right.
which you have the permission to deny.
Right, and you're going to define use permits in a separate section.
And that'll be defined, and those will still be shown as, no, you need to have a use
Right.
permit, and you still have to go through that process of getting the discretionary permit. But the thing that I think might be confusing about the first table, which is why I changed it when I got to the second table, is that for the uses that have a U, as long as the property owner follows the rules for that use, it is a permitted use. In other words, there's no discretion involved by the town on whether to be able to turn it down. So for example, temporary housing on this list, it is outright permitted as long as you meet the requirements.
Right.
So it's during the construction.
So I think that that's very clear. I don't think we need the C and the U because they're kind of confusing. So I agree with taking the U out. Honestly, I've been on this council for over 2 years and I've not seen one use permit. So have I, Fernando? I don't think so.
Vice Mayor, typically the use permits go through the Board of Adjustments, as long as, and variances as well.
So is that state law?
That is state law.
Interesting. Okay. Use permits have to go through Board of Adjustments and they can't come to council. That's the question.
Well, if that's what he said, actually, state law does allow you to take a use permit through a different process, and different places do them differently. There are, and again, you get into particular locally undesirable land uses where you want to really rake them over the coals before you give it to them. There are communities that take conditional use permits that are for very sensitive uses through basically the same process as a rezoning. You go to the planning commission and then to the council.
I'd like to see that here instead of going to Board of Adjustments. But I'm just one vote.
Mr. Cassidy, can you give an example? You said like sensitive issues. What's an example in your mind of a sensitive issue?
So for example, normally a locally undesirable land use would be something like a sexually oriented business. Some places will require conditional use permits with a pretty high level of review for things like these stores where you pawn shops, for example. And the reason for that is, if you can imagine, they have negative impacts on the immediate neighbors. And so typically those are locally undesirable land uses. Now, in my list, I've added things to to locally undesirable land use only because I've perceived by the way your code treats certain uses that for whatever reason, they're not as desirable in here. And an example of that, which is a head scratcher to me, is craft places. You know, in your code, you can't have a craft shop in C1. You can only have a craft shop in C2 if it's accessory to a residential use. You can't have an outright permitted use of craft shop until C3. C3. To me, that's a little bizarre. I would have said, well, my wife is a crafter, so, to me, what she does with the craft stuff should easily be allowed in the C1.
That's like a Michael's and a Joann's, right?
That's what I would think.
Yeah.
Mr. Mayor, could I ask a
Yes, sir,
clarification
absolutely.
question? Isn't there a difference statewide about different conditional use permits? They're treated differently by different jurisdictions. And of course, we have both a use permit and a conditional use permit. Isn't that some of what's going on here in terms of, because conditional use permits can be handled by the council, I believe, but not use permits? Isn't that how it is?
Mr. Mayor and Mr. Legler, yes, I mean, essentially, if it's a use that is allowed as long as you meet certain specifically adopted requirements, then that's the kind of use permit, if you will, that would typically go to the Board of Adjustment. There's no real discretion involved. All you're asking the Board of Adjustment to do is make a finding that they've jumped over those hoops. And then in that kind of use permit, yes.
And
I would
statewide,
agree.
isn't there even a difference in definitions between?
Yes, now, it's
Conditional
not
use
in state statute, by the way, but it is in the case law. So, for example, there's a case out of Avondale, I believe it was, involving a conditional use permit, where the court held that that was an administrative type of conditional use permit. And for administrative, even though it went to the council, essentially what the court was saying, that because it's just administrative, you're just making sure that they were meeting the requirements, that's the kind of use that probably should have gone to the Board of Adjustment. Whereas there was a case involving, actually two cases, one involving Marana and then the other one involving someplace else, and it's in the Phoenix area, and I can't remember the situation, but where the conditional use permit was found to be a legislative type process with discretion, and those can go to the council, and depending on how sensitive a use it is, it can even be required to go to the commission and to the council. So,
As you're-
yes.
As you're hearing this discussion, do you have any thoughts then about where you think our code needs to go in that regard?
Well, I have a question before you answer that, if it's okay, Mr. Mayor. So on this screen in front of us, this looks like utility buildings and facilities, model homes, golf courses, telecom, nursing homes in certain zones, boarding houses and orphanages all have to go to our Board of Adjustments and don't come to us because they're Cs. Am I reading that right?
Those are Cs, they're under 1321-110. I didn't remember that was actually to Board of Adjustment, but let me just look, I've got it right here, 1320.
I'm just going by, you just said that all of our conditional use permits go to Board of
Yes.
Adjustment.
That's what I had
Not
said.
conditional use permits, use permits. There's a
Okay,
difference.
use permits, I'm sorry.
Those pesky orphanages.
Yeah.
Well, in any event, to the extent you separate out conditional use permits from use permits, the ones that go to the Board of Adjustment, in my opinion, should be the ones where the Board of Adjustment's only role is to make sure that the standards that have been established by the council for a particular use in a particular zone, that those have simply been met, that it's not a judgment call necessarily. If there's some kind of judgment call involved in whether a use fits a particular area, in my opinion, that's the kind of conditional use permit that should come to the council.
I agree.
So we need to be clear about that. And actually, in the next iteration, I appreciate that. I will keep that in mind in putting together the use, although it may complicate, or the use table might complicate the use table a little bit. But nevertheless, it should be clear. We need to try to be clear about that. In any event, getting back to this idea of perhaps putting, uses into groups, I guess the question would be, how you feel about some of these uses, whether you would care that, for example, secondhand stores, for some reason, a lot of places feel like secondhand stores have a little bit of a negative impact. But on the other hand, most of my friends buy things at secondhand stores, so I don't know, and I do too, so.
Just a couple of things. If we were to look at, say, a gun shop, and you put a gun shop across from Robert and Spouse on the southeast corner, there's a little strip mall right there. If you put a gun shop there, I don't see that as being bad for the community, or maybe even a jewelry store in that location right there. Those are things that I think we're just being a little more restrictive than we probably should be. If they're selling things, for the most part, they should be able to go in a commercial area for the most, what I believe. Yeah, of course, there's certain restrictions we have for sex shops, but we're not going to list some or put someone that's doing Etsy home crafts in the same category as a sex shop. But from what I'm seeing, it looks like that's what we're doing.
Mr. Mayor and Mr. Cassidy, so C1 is a light commercial zone that's consistent with residential. That's why we see it along Robert Rowe. C2 is a more retail commercial zone, big box store. And our C3 is more like heavy commercial and light manufacturing.
Well, I
Yes.
would defer to Fernando, but I would think actually C3 is more like the big box, and I would think of C2 as more the neighborhood residential, but
That's not what our zone says.
I'm not,
Yeah.
You are correct, Vice Mayor.
Yeah.
C2 is more of the big box store. C3 is minor industrial, and that's the way our
Which
code
is
is
the
written.
problem we had when Caliber Collision came in, because that was allowed in the C3, even though it was on 69 and the entry to our town. But since it was allowed in C3, it was allowed there. We had to change the zone, yeah. So, but I agree with you. If it's designated C3, it should not be light manufacturing like we have it now. And I don't know if that's something you can clean up or not. Because then that will require things to be changed, and I don't know if we can do that.
Well, Mr. Mayor and Vice Mayor Hunt, I think after having gone through this process for the last couple of months since we talked the first time I talked to you, I thought maybe it would be possible to avoid reducing uses for people. But I'm convinced now that in this process, you are going to inevitably reduce some uses for people, because just in the process of making things make sense, I believe there are going to be situations where you're going to say, you know what, we always did allow this use here, but when you look at everything, it really probably doesn't fit here, and we probably need to remove it. And the question you asked is, can you do that? You can do that, but when you do that, you open yourself up to a Prop 207 claim, a diminution claim, which we're trying not to do. But that would bring me to the last thing I actually covered on this outline, is that, you know, really, since I do believe now that you're going to run into this sort of situation, of probably having some diminution claims, because you are going to tinker with the uses, I think you probably should consider a text amendment that I think, frankly, you need already anyway, just to deal with annexations. But the last attachment is what I think a way around, or at least a way to deal with this issue of diminution claims. So I put it up on the screen now. It's just a draft of something I put together, but it's basically conditional uses that are allowed by the council. These would come to the council, and they only come to the council in two circumstances. One circumstance is when there's an annexation. And the reason I believe you really should have a special procedure for annexations is state law says that the annexing municipality shall allow uses and densities no greater than those allowed in the county. Well, back in the days when counties and municipalities had basically the same zoning ordinances, I know that in Pima County, for example, we had a city, county zoning staff. The same staff worked for the county and the city. You had exactly the same zoning ordinance for the county that you did for the city. It's just the county designations had an extra C in front of the designation. That's the way you knew it was a county designation. So back in those days, when you got annexed, it was obvious what zone you went into. It's not obvious anymore. Everywhere across the state now, the municipalities have totally different zoning ordinances from the counties. And because of that, and because of the way state law works, that you can't give zoning uses or densities greater than what were allowed in the county on the one hand. But on the other hand, Prop 207, it says, if you reduce my uses, you're going to get a diminution claim. Because of that, I recommend that you have something like what I've provided to you here, which is a procedure that allows, upon annexation, for you as a council in the annexation ordinance to say, okay, I'm giving you R1L, but because the particular zoning in the county allowed you to do such and such a use, and because you're telling me that you wanted to do that use, your R1L comes with a conditional use upon annexation.
If I could just explain, that's why we had an RCU district. It was because almost all of the county zoning was RCU, and so it was RCU 2A. And so almost everything that was ever annexed by the town was RCU 2A. That's why we had an RCU district.
So this would take care of other situations, though. I mean, if you didn't happen to annex an R2A area in the county, you'd be stuck, in my view. But in any event, so this procedure deals with that, but it also deals with diminution claims. And the reason why I really wanted to provide it to you today, or at least a draft of something like this procedure to you today, is because in looking at the uses, it did become clear to me that we are going to be tinkering with what uses are permitted. And this would allow you, upon getting a claim a diminution claim, you could say to somebody, okay, we just did this zoning code rewrite, and you're right, we did eliminate some uses, but what is it that you really are upset about, Mr. Property Owner? Is there something you could live with that you used to have that you now don't have? Do we have to undo our entire change for your property, or is there something else that you could live with? And they might say, well, yeah, I used to be able to do whatever, some use that, so for example, I used to be able in C3 to do, heavy automotive work, and now you've taken it out of that. And for my particular property, I'm going to pursue a diminution claim if you don't allow it on this particular piece of property. And it would allow you, as part of that process, directly as a council to say, all right, conditional use upon dealing with a diminution claim, we will allow that use on that property. That way you don't have to throw, most of the property owners that you're going to deal with are going to say, I don't care that you reduce one use. I'm not going to submit a claim on that. It allows you to at least move forward with most of what you want to accomplish and just deal with that individual property owner.
But it seems like when we annex something, large amount of property, the county allows multiple accessory dwellings, cows and pigs and horses, but in the town, we want to zone it R1. So, which doesn't allow multiple accessory units and cows and pigs and horses. So how do we get by that?
Well, Mr. Mayor and Vice Mayor Hunt, in my experience, that's one of the reasons why people won't annex in, for one thing, all right? And by not being able to deal with some of those particular concerns of people, those are hurdles to you being able to do the annexation to begin with. But this would then allow you, if somebody says, you know what, in the county I had a agricultural exemption, and I want to be able to have more horses, or horses in a place where you don't want to have horses, it would allow you then to make the translation and allow that particular use. So it ends up being an annexation tool for you to try to deal with folks who otherwise would not be interested in talking to you.
Mr. Mayor and Vice Mayor, if I could, historically what the town has done is annex the area and then they had a grandfathered use. And as long as they didn't change it, no matter what zoning we put on it, they could continue to do that as a matter of law. So we would work with them, negotiate with them, talk to them about, usually they didn't want, as has been pointed out, they weren't willing to annex unless they had some future concept down the road.
Mayor, Vice Mayor. So what we would do is at the time of annexation, those uses that were pre-existing would be legal non-conforming uses and would be allowed to exist until they were changed, altered, or diminished.
Although, if I could interject, though, the trouble with that is that means it has to be an existing established use for that to be useful. I think you'll find that upon annexation, a lot of times people haven't yet established a use. The reason they don't want to come in to the town is they have the idea, I always wanted to have a horse farm or something there, and I can easily have that at the county if I stay in the county, and I'm not going to be able to establish that in the town. This procedure doesn't require the use to have already been established. You could, upon annexation, you could say, all right, fine, if that's what's keeping you from being annexed, then as a conditional use upon annexation, as a use you have in the county, will translate you to a different use, a different zone in the town, a residential land use, for example, but we will permit as a conditional use upon annexation through this process that special use that you want to keep from the county. In any event, so that's the reason I segued to this, though, is it sort of answers your question, well, what happens? It looks like we're going to be changing some of these uses. Yes, I think we are probably, and we probably will get some diminution claims, and this will be at least some tool, one tool perhaps to help you with that. In any event, so I don't know if you wanted to have further discussion on that. But I guess what I'd like to see how you feel about some of these other uses. You know, in addition to the generic retail group use, if you look at, for example, different food uses, the way they're listed in your code, they're all separately listed. I mean, you've got restaurant, bakery, cafe, cafeterias, candy shops, delicatessen, grocery stores, supermarket, health food stores, ice cream parlors. Basically, they're all low impact, in my view, low impact restaurant uses that probably could be combined together. And again, in C1, you're going to have the size limitation anyway. So whether you call yourself, you know, a cafe or a delicatessen or whatever, that should be just one use on the use list, in my view. But I'd be happy to hear otherwise. And the same then goes for the service group. So this is where right now you already allow banks, barbers, shops, beauty shops, various other things, but some of them you don't allow, and I'm not sure why. Maybe blueprinting, printing, lithograph, maybe that's a bigger thing. I mean, in my experience, though, a lot of times you have basically a small shop that does that sort of thing, you know. Admittedly, there are bigger versions of those that you wouldn't want in C1, but I think you can deal with that by saying, yeah, you're limited to 2,000 square feet. If you want to be the store that, the FedEx store, the small FedEx store that does some copying and shipping and whatever, fine, you're fine in C1 as long as you're a small box of that. If you want to be basically print news, I don't know if people still do print newspapers. I think most of the newspaper print manufacturing places have kind of closed down. But in any event, obviously, once you're getting to a much bigger operation, then you would need to be in a different zone just by virtue of the size alone. But as a practical matter, you know, key shops, why are key shops not allowed? I mean, maybe it's because, why are they not allowed in C1? I think it's because they're listed with gun shops right now, key shops and key and gun shops, and those aren't allowed until, you know, they're not allowed in C1.
I think, I'm sorry to interrupt, sir, but for example, key shops, I mean, back in the day, Norm's Lock and Key was on the corner of Robert and Lakeshore. And that Robert Road is C1. So I'm kind of confused, though. I mean, it worked fine in that location, but according to this, though, C1 wouldn't have allowed.
Mayor, there are some corners in
Okay.
Robert Road and Spouse that are C2, just the outlined areas.
Gotcha.
Are C1s, but on the corner of the intersections, the main intersections, those are C2 and allowed for the gas stations.
Gotcha.
So, Mr. Mayor, I have a question. That is, I see down here, you say auto service station, self-serve, that's a gas station. Then you say auto service station and garages, including motor repair and complete servicing. So that could be like a tire shop, an oil change, light stuff like that.
Along those lines, what I'm recommending, Vice Mayor, is, and this is on item 4, is if you look at the current code, you have, and you look at the different uses on the list that are automobile type uses, to a large extent, those change, well, let me just go to the list. If you look, automobile service stations, self-service are allowed with certain specific conditions in the C1. The specific conditions are that they have to comply with various
Oh, yeah.
things. But in any event, they are actually allowed, but as you do more repair type work, as they become more obnoxious, then they're not allowed. Then they require the higher use. In my view, I think that what we could do is say, look, as a general use category, fine, yes, a self-service style, just filling up your car with gas kind of station, it is also, even though it's a pretty low impact use, it's going to have some of the same conditions that a heavy use of that type is going to have, because you're dealing with gas. When you're dealing with gas, you're going to have various conditions, and if you look at your code, all of the gas and other fuel type uses have the same basic list. It's repeated like 4 or 5 different times in the code that say, okay, you have to show that the fire district has approved this use. You have to submit a development plan to make sure that separations are met and various things. All of those things are going to apply whether the use is a relatively low impact use or a high impact use, because you're dealing with gasoline or fuel. So but the details of that use and the negative impacts of the use, that's how we would decide whether it belongs in C1,
Right.
where you're just filling your gas tank, or whether you have to be all the way in performance manufacturing or M1 because you are dropping engines. You see what I'm saying? So
I have a couple more questions, Mr. Mayor.
Yes, ma'am.
So everything on this number 3 where it says discussion of possible, there.
yes.
That's all, you're recommending that all goes in C1, even the italicized, if we're okay with it?
In essence, yes. Under this number 1 here, for example, I'm saying, based on some of the other things you've already got that are allowed in C1, why not allow these things in C1? And then the same thing would be for number 2, the service group uses, yes, even the italicized ones, which currently are not really allowed in C1, I would say, why not put them together with the other uses
Right.
and allow them in C1?
Well, and appliance repair shops can be all inside the building with a condition, yeah.
Yes.
Okay, so my question is under number 2, and I think I sent this in my list to you. So we have small studios like exercising studios, or the ones where you do stations, high intensity impact, or Pilates, and they only take 6 or 8 people at a time, parking wise, so they should not be considered like an LA Fitness. So I'm hoping we can put them in under number 2. Because in my mind, they're like a hair salon or a nail salon or something like that, where they have 6 stations.
Like the 24-hour fitness sort of things that, although whether it is actually open 24 hours, is the kinds of small workout facilities that are in a small, totally indoors, in a small box.
Like 8 people at a time, not like
Yes.
an LA Fitness that should go in a higher zone. So if we could add that to service group, that would be great. And then under number 3, other subjects, we talked about the downtown overlay zone last time. And I think we talked about it being more than just downtown. We talked about it being like the fringe of Highway 69, that area where we have some older commercial that we could put an overlay zone on, and then maybe start attracting some attainable housing developers that could come in and purchase and then do higher multiple, high density attainable housing where there's walkability to the downtown. So I'm hoping that we can still do that downtown overlay, not just in downtown, but some of 69. And then I think Gilbert also said some of Robert Road. where there's some commercial some tired commercial that maybe a developer could come in and do high density.
Yes, that, we've not actually tackled, we've discussed it some, but we've not actually tackled and brought to you the elements of that overlay. But yes, it would allow the multiple.
Not just in downtown is what I'm
Not,
saying.
it's wherever you would decide you want to put it.
And then electrical charging stations will be allowed in any parking lot, probably?
The discussion that we've had is that when we're rewriting the parking requirements, there's going to be an element, we're going to have a threshold for when you have to have the electrical charging stations.
Oh, good, okay.
So it's going to be part of the parking, at least the way we're discussing it, it would be part of the parking requirements. You get
So
to a
both
certain
commercial-
threshold, and then you need, if you have a certain number of spaces, then there needs to be at least,
And in multifamily and single-family residential, maybe at the clubhouse. Okay, and then water resource conditions, so we're talking about maybe allowing water retention, I'm going to say it, from the roof, collection in single-family lots that are large enough. So it would be kind of like rainwater harvesting, but it would be like in a humongous French drain, so much so that it's like 40% collected of what that house would use in a year. April's working on that. So I don't know if that's an automatic permitted use in a single-family residential zone. I don't know if we need to address that in the zoning code.
Mr. Mayor and Madam Vice Mayor, the city of Tucson has a provision, and it can be basically written in as an outright permitted
Okay.
activity throughout the entire town. I'm not sure that you would put it in individual zones. You'd put it in a general section of
Or
the code and
definition
say,
or
look,
something.
it doesn't matter where you are, you can do this. I will say that it's possible you could get some pushback actually by surface water rate users, believe it or not. I mean, I've been in situations where people have come out and complained about those sorts of ordinances.
Talk to Councilwoman Hepperly, she's working on it. And then my last thing is attainable housing. So the mayor established a task force, a couple of the members are here from that task force, and they're working on a report to bring back to council on how to attract more attainable housing in Prescott Valley. So this overlay zone and the high-density residential are very important. And we talked to you, I think, about including some automatic incentives somehow that attainable housing could qualify for. And one of them that we talked about the other day, and I know the county P&Z did this on a project that ended up not being approved, but it was very creative, where if a at-market developer comes in with a project, a big enough project, that they're required either on that site to do a percentage of inclusionary housing and/or pay some funds to a housing trust fund that the town would have for a project that comes in the future, so we would have funds available to pay for diff fees or building fees or what have you. So I think it's permitted in the state because the county did it. Is that true or not?
Yes, it is permitted, and I think
It would be
you
a
were at the
developer agreement.
meeting where where the builders were complaining actually about, no, you were in Sedona, right?
Right.
They were actually complaining about it at the Flagstaff meeting, but nevertheless, there was an acknowledgement that it is allowed under state law, but the push was to make it prohibited under state law. They're trying to get a prohibition of that. But yes, right now, you can, as an incentive, allow higher density if a developer brings affordable units to the table. And there have been a lot of places that have used that. But that's the thing that a lot of developers complain about. There was a Flagstaff developer at the housing meeting who said, well, for me to get my rezoning that allowed 58 units, I had to, no, I'm sorry, it was much more than that. It was 169 units, 10% of those, 16, had to be affordable housing units, and he was complaining about the cost of that to him. But the thing that wasn't, of course, highlighted in that discussion was, yeah, but you got a rezoning that took you probably from 5 units, that you could have on that property to 169, and in the process, yes, you had to provide 16 units that were affordable. Yes, that's permissible as long as it's done as an incentive. In other words, if, as part of that process, for example, I believe they probably would have said to that developer, and you don't have to do the affordable units, but if you don't do them, you only get 100 units.
Right, and that can all be addressed in a developer agreement, correct?
That can be addressed in a development agreement, or you could do just a standard code provision that tells you what the incentive is if you want to do that. There are a lot of devilish details in those, by the way, but yes, for example, how do you make sure it stays affordable? Does the town stay involved in that process? Or do you only worry about the first iteration being affordable and then, in other words, there are things you'd have to think about in creating an ordinance of that type.
Well, attainable housing is so important to us, and we don't have funds or even a staff for that right now. And so that's something that this task force is looking at to recommend to the town. So if you have samples of that being included in the zoning code in other areas, could you send those to us? Do you mind?
Yes,
Okay.
I can do that.
So Frank, I have a few questions. So reference the C1 in the Spouse neighborhood and also on the Robert Road to Ranger area. We have a lot of Mexican restaurants and grocery stores on Spouse, and there's also a Mexican grocery store on Robert Road. And it seems like, back to what the mayor was saying about Norm's Lock and Safe, they were on the corner of one of those roads. I think it was Florentine and Robert Road. But you also have down Robert Road in times past, you've had a tarot card business. You had a masseuse and yoga business almost right next door. You have a chiropractic office there now, and you have a law office, and this is all on Robert Road. How do you differentiate, the C1 and C2? The businesses, they've been there a very long time, and I'm just curious, with the grandfather clause take into consideration these businesses? Are we going to, how is that going to come about, is my question.
Mr. Mayor, Councilmember Dickinson, right now, the way it's distinguished primarily is that in C1, it has to be all enclosed, and it can't be more than 2,000 square feet. So it deals with it in terms of size of the use to a large extent, and then the enclosure of the use. But pretty much all of the uses that you've mentioned right now are allowed in C1 as long as they meet the standards for enclosure and size, and some other requirements. They're in the footnotes, but in any event, so right now they are. I mean, there are some uses that might be considered a little bit more Lulu type, locally undesirable land use type, like the tarot cards. But on the other hand, how much of a land use impact do those really have? I mean, so at least from my perspective, I was not planning to separate those out for negative treatment any more than, than some of the other uses that are already allowed in the C1.
So the multi-use or the multiple uses, like what the mayor brought up, and certain corners are C3. I mean, so the whole road is not designated as C1 or C2. It's all broken down into different uses is how I gather.
Yes, I mean, it is what it is. For you to change that, you'd have to go through a rezoning process if you wanted to change some of that zoning, but I don't really recommend that you doing that as part of this process. And for that matter, if you were to downzone property, you definitely would get the diminution claim, I would think, if you were to say, you know, in this area, it makes more sense for all of this property to be C1 than the property owners who have C2 and C3 that you downzone, you're going to get a diminution claim from.
Could you explain a diminution? I can't
Yes.
even say the word claim.
Diminution claim, that means that there's a state law that says that, for some reason I've somehow lost my screen here, sorry, that basically says any change in zoning, change in your zoning ordinance, any change that, even annexation action that you take as a town that has the result of reducing the value, the market value of a piece of property, entitles that property owner to submit a claim to the town for compensation. And the compensation amount is the diminished value of their property caused by your land use action. That's why it's called a diminution claim, is because they're saying, look, I used to be able in C3 zone to drop engines, and now as a result of your zoning rewrite, I have to have performance manufacturing to do that. And so now my property isn't worth as much. It used to be worth $2.30 a square foot. Now it's worth $2 a square foot. I want you to pay me the 30 cents a square foot. And if you don't, I'm going to file a lawsuit against you. So that's, the state law allows a diminution claim of that type. Now, they have to have an appraiser actually to say, yes, it has reduced the value of your property, but if you've worked with appraisers, I'm sure they'll find an appraiser to say whatever they want along those lines, especially if a use has in fact been lost. Although, you know, as a town, you can also argue that, hey, some of these changes have actually made C3 zoning more valuable because we got rid of some of the things that were undesirable. So that's the kind of little legal dance you can make. But that's what a diminution claim is. All right, well, thank you so much for your feedback. If you have any other comments or questions, please let me know, and we'll just keep pursuing it. I think our next step then will be to try to come back with a table of, okay, well, how does this look to you in terms of the uses as we go forward in the actual code. I've shown you the uses as they exist, and we've talked about consolidating some of these uses. So next you'll probably see a table, and then also some of the other issues that have been raised will have information for you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Mr. Cassidy. With that being said, folks, we're going to adjourn, and we're actually, in about 5 minutes or 10 minutes, we're going to be going into executive session, so we'll need to clear the room. Thanks for coming out.